How's everyone doing today? David Michael, Bhairav Healing. Welcome to the third episode of the Bhairav Healing Podcast. Today, I thought I would share sort of a story that popped in my head the other day. And I hadn't really thought about it in a while. And, it sort of goes towards the more healing piece of Bhairav Healing and not so much psychedelics, although if it weren't for psychedelics, I probably wouldn't have come to the conclusions that I came to. So I'm going to take you guys back to the year 2022/2023, early 2023. I was in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina for a little while because my stepfather had some health issues, and my mother was also having some health issues, and she couldn't really handle it all by herself. So I went down there to give her a hand to help her out. I had been living in Virginia, basically living as a monk on the mountain there for a little while. And I saw this as a continuation of my monk experience, was to, be of service, be of give seva to my family, which I thought, there's nothing better than that, right? So I got to South Carolina, and after a couple of months, my stepfather had a really, really intense situation going on down there, and he was in and out of the hospital, and they had to put him in the hospital in Charleston, which is about 2.5-3 hours away. And my mom and I would be driving back and forth down to Charleston almost every day for months at a time. And to make a very long story short, about 2 months into me staying there and being able to help my mother with this. The plan was for me to help my mom get my stepfather through this. And then my mother was going to have knee surgery. So I was going to stay, help her get through that. And then I was going to head back out. I thought it would be maybe 2 or 3 month process tops, So life, as it does, threw me a big curveball when 2 months into it, my mom dropped dead of a heart attack in front of my brother and I, very unexpectedly. We were getting ready to go to Charleston in the morning, and she had the heart attack and she passed away. And, as traumatic as that was, and that's a whole another podcast we can talk about, that put me in a position where I kind of had to deal with my stepfather's situation, basically on my own. And my brother was around, but he had a full-time job and a family, and he just wasn't able to commit to the time that I was. So I did. And to give you a little bit of history on this, my stepfather and I have a very difficult relationship. We always have from day one. And it made it even more challenging because my mother was always sort of the buffer between us. And she was gone, and we were both grieving, and he was also in the hospital, and I was making this drive back and forth and getting him into the rehabilitation. And then once I got him home, I was his primary caregiver. So I had to go to the doctors. I had to figure out all of his medications. I had to, make sure he was walking around safely. I had to drive him. Just all the caretaker stuff. Which again was incredibly challenging in and of its own, but also even more so because he and I did not get along very well. We did not see eye to eye on just about anything, and we really never have. So it was, there was a lot of lessons being taught to me in that time period. But kind of why I'm telling this story now is I'm going to, bring it back to the present moment. Right? A couple of days ago, my partner, Josiel, and I went on a picnic, and we went to Golden Gate Park, and we went to the botanical flower garden and set up our stuff. And there was a bunch of Canadian geese there. And if you guys know anything about Canadian geese, they can be brats. And, there was probably about 15 or 20 of them, and we set up our little picnic. And of course, they came over, and my partner Josiel was a little she didn't want them around. She thought maybe they would like jump on the blanket and steal our food and stuff like that. But I was kind of stoked to see them, and I was kind of like happy for them to be around. And I told her, like, it'll be okay. Like, as long as we don't actually feed them, they're probably just going to like lay down after a minute and chill with us. And then, they'll go on their merry way. And that's exactly what they did. And I really enjoyed that experience. And the reason why I'm so familiar with Canadian geese is because when I was in Myrtle Beach, right before Myrtle Beach, I was living literally in the mountains, the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia, doing monk stuff, meditating out in the snow and communing with nature. I lived in a very, very, very isolated, like on a mountain, and there was only 4 or 5 people that lived on this mountain. The closest town was about 30 minutes away, and it was a really small town. It really just had like a Walmart and a Target in there, and a couple of restaurants and things like that. So I was out there, and I'd been out there for almost a year. And I was really, just kind of connecting with nature, and I really, got into that for that time period. It was a real gift to be out there. And when I got to Myrtle Beach, even though Myrtle Beach isn't a huge city, it's, it's suburban. There's a lot of people there. We lived in this sort of cul-de-sac, or, my brother and my parents lived in this like cul-de-sac sort of like a community. And, there were neighbors right next to each other. And me just coming out of the mountains into that was a little much. And then Charleston obviously is a city, so I was in Charleston a lot. And my point is I was doing a lot more communicating with humans than I had done in a minute. So it took me a second to adjust to that. And then when you take into account the challenges I was having just being around my stepfather in general, then caregiving, grieving for my mom just passing away, anytime I wasn't doing anything for him, I would be outside out back, because there was this little man-made pond there, and there was a bunch of Canadian geese, probably about 30 of them, that would hang out. And then there was also a bunch of turtles, like big painted turtles that lived in the pond. And there were these 2 ducks, which is funny, like this big crew of Canadian geese. And then there were these 2 ducks, mallards. One was a male, one was a female. I called them Fred and Ethel. And there was other ducks there, but they kind of kept to themselves. But these ducks hung out with the geese. They were like, wherever the geese were, these 2 ducks were. So anyway, I would go out there and sit next to the pond and meditate as much as possible. I would get up at like 5:30 in the morning, get my stepfather situated, get him his medicines, get him some breakfast, get him in front of the news, because he loves watching, news all day. And then I would go out and I would do my meditation. And these geese were like my buddies. I became kind of friends with them. And there was one goose in particular who had a broken wing, and he couldn't like fly, because they would fly off in the afternoon and come back. And he was just there all day. I called him Kickin' Wing. And so he chilled with me a lot. And I would sit out there, and I would I'd go to the pond, and I'd always have some crackers or something, and I would give the turtles some crackers. And it got to the point where if I just stood next to the pond, no matter what time of day, all the turtles would come up, because they equated me being there with food, I'm sure. And then if I had extra crackers, I'd give some to the geese and the ducks and stuff like that. But more often than not, I would just meditate. I would just sit there and meditate with these geese. And they would just sit there like 15, 20, sometimes 30 deep with me, all just sitting there meditating. Fred and Ethel would show up, and the turtles would kind of just hang out on the edge of the pond. And I would just be sitting there with these animals. And it was such a beautiful experience, because I was really going through it. I mean, really, 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 grieving and fighting with myself and wanting to just leave, because, the situation was very challenging. But I knew that I needed to see it through, at least to the point where my stepfather was able to walk and get himself around and handle his own stuff. And, these geese they were like a godsend to me. They really, really helped me to get through this process and maintain my sanity while I was going through this craziness, in a graceful way, with courage. Because I knew whenever I'd go outside that they would be there. And, this might sound a little bit odd to people who aren't very connected to animals or haven't had an experience like this, where they were put into a very, very traumatic situation, and had to find like a ray of light in it to get through it, and I am very, very connected to the animal world. I love animals. I was vegan for a really long time, ethically, because I love animals. I don't like to eat them. And even over the past like 6 months, I've sort of dabbled in like eating fish and chicken again. I thought maybe my protein the levels were off or something. So I thought maybe I should start eating fish or something. But, I really didn't like it. It didn't take again. I figured out that I didn't miss it. I didn't miss eating meat. I just didn't enjoy it because I love animals. And this is not like a soapbox. Like I'm not saying this because I'm trying to influence or inspire anyone else to stop eating meat. I don't care what other people do. I'm not like a warrior trying to like shame people into like not eating meat or whatever, like that's not my thing. It's, my connection to the animal world is my thing. And my, I'm sort of back full circle into veganism now, because the eating meat thing just didn't take. I didn't feel any better physically, so I don't think the protein thing was a thing. And I really just didn't like the way I felt. When I would see a bird fly by, or we have a bunch of ravens that hang out here on our fire escape, and I was like, oh, I just ate a chicken. It just didn't make me feel right. So, and I'm like this with animals in general. I mean, I just love animals. I love cats. I love dogs. I lived out in the woods. There was a family of foxes that would kind of come around and frolic around, and raccoons were always around, and opossums, and so many different kinds of birds and snakes and bugs. And, I love all of them. I don't distinguish a fly from a cat, from a dog, from a whale. Like I love all animals. I love all living creatures, humans included, even though, humans can be problematic and challenging to deal with sometimes. I still really very much, I'm a fan of living organisms, of plants. We have plants everywhere here. I'm a big plant guy as well. And that sort of love for the natural world is definitely a two-pronged thing. Because when I was younger, I didn't feel that way, really. I did a lot of camping. I was in Cub Scouts and Boy Scouts, and I enjoyed it for sure. But I didn't connect with it like I did after I started using plant medicine. And really seeing the process of how interconnected we are with everything. And listen, like as a human, you got to eat something, right? You got to eat a plant, or you got to eat an animal, or you're just kind of eating some man-made chemical stuff, which is really terrible for you, So that's why I'm not bummed out when other humans eat animals. I'm especially not bummed out when people who, go hunting and they feed their families with a deer, for 3 or 4 months or whatever that is. I think that that's actually beautiful, that you can sustain your family and use every part of the animal and that sort of thing. And even if you're just getting a roast chicken from Costco, I mean, cool. Like you got to eat, you got to figure that out for yourself. So again, I'm not pushing any kind of agenda here, no vegan agenda, no vegetarian agenda. But my connection with animals definitely comes from the many different plant medicines that I've tried, the different plant medicine experiences that I've had. And, I think I even talked about in my last podcast about how I don't like to use the bufo from the toads, because you got to harass the toads a little bit to get them to excrete the venom for you to be able to smoke. And I'm just not, like, why harass a living animal when you can get that from so many other plants that, won't necessarily die if you harvest them, some will. There, a lot of times the DMT is in the root system. So if you're like obviously tearing up a whole plant to use its roots, you're going to kill it. But you can get it off of leaves and seeds. And again, this is why I really, really believe in the mushrooms. The mushrooms, you take the fruit off of it, the mycelium is still there. You're not killing the whole structure. And again, you can grow them very easily yourself. You don't have to like destroy an environment. You don't have to destroy a culture. You don't have to colonize anything. You don't have to harass an animal. You can, very easily get a kit, put them under your sink, let them grow, and harvest them, and the mycelium will still be there. And you can oftentimes harvest 2 or 3 batches off of one batch of mycelium. So I just really, really believe in using the mushrooms if you're going to be working with the plants in a structured way, and I'm not saying don't explore, like absolutely do your thing. I'm not really saying anything. I'm kind of just telling you what I believe in for myself and for my business and how I move forward with that sort of thing. So anyway, back to the geese. When we were having the picnic, I really, I didn't want my partner to get upset that the geese were there, and start kind of like shooing them away and stuff like that, because I kind of wanted them to be there. But there's like with geese, you kind of have to draw boundaries sometimes, because there's always one brat in the bunch that's going to try to like be a habitual line stepper. And I spent so much time with these guys in Myrtle Beach, and I would like feed them out of my hand. I got most of them to trust me enough that they would feed me out of my hand. And sometimes even when I was meditating, they'd come over and just nip at my toes very gently because they wanted more crackers. And I was meditating. But there'd always be one like brat who would come in and start squawking and honking, and you'd have to just kind of like give him a gentle like, and he would like, he or she would settle down and simmer back down. But I feel like with animals in general, that's kind of a good way to handle them, like having fear and being aggressive and yelling at them very often doesn't even work. You know what I mean? But like, if you can kind of like show no fear and be steady, but also, have kindness in your heart and love in your heart. Like, I really believe that animals feel that. They feel that from a person. If they feel that you're a threat, then you might get jumped on, but if they feel like you're not a threat and that you're, I don't know, like for lack of a better term, a kind person, a good person, more often than not, they'll just chill with you. I can't tell you how many times meditating out in the woods, which I lived in Virginia for a year. And then I also was deep in the canyons of Sonoma County, California, really, really isolated again for another almost year. And I was doing the same thing. I would meditate and then go into town and a couple of days a week volunteer in food banks and things like that. I had a lot of experiences in Sonoma County. I even had one with a mountain lion where it came down the canyon wall, and I thought it was just a big cat at first, because there's all kinds of feral canyon cats up there, like these big orange tabbies, and they would come around and hang out with me. And I thought he was one of them at first, but it was a mountain lion. And then he bolted back up, and I was like, ooh, that was not a kitty or a little kitty. But, he didn't try to jump on me. He didn't try to harass me. He was in kind of my meditation area where I am all the time. So, if he was stalking that area, he might have seen me before. The foxes, the raccoons, they would just kind of come around and, they'd keep their distance, but they would still 10 yards away, just kind of lay down and relax, It's so many amazing experiences with deer and foxes and ravens. And, I love that aspect of being alive. I love the aspect of being on this planet with so many different animals and so many different people and so many different plants. And my love for this and my understanding for this really, really came from my experiences. And it's been a very healing experience, because I feel like if I hadn't have had the plant medicine or psychedelic experiences that I had had prior to going to Myrtle Beach, especially when all that stuff happened, I wouldn't have been able to see the beauty in sitting out back with all of those geese and the turtles and things like that. It wouldn't have helped me get through the day in the same way. If anything, it might have irritated me, and I might have been the guy chasing them away because they poop on your lawn and stuff like that. I mean, animals are animals. They're going to poop. Like every couple of days I'd go out there and I'd, clean up as much as I could, and I'd mow the lawn and get it, sort of dispersed, and no big deal, but if I hadn't have had the sort of healing experiences before that I got from the plants or the fungi, that experience would have been much, much, much different. And I was without any of those molecules for most of the time that I was there. Cannabis is not legal in South Carolina, or at least it wasn't then. And they have these things called Delta 8 and Delta 9. It's something it's like a derivative from hemp, that there's a legal loophole that they could sell there. And some of it's really, really sketchy from like gas stations and stuff like that. But they also had these like stores that were like really nice, and they had like a whole, if you live in a state where cannabis is legal and you ever went to a dispensary, you'll know that sometimes the cannabis companies will like have a flyer with all the different, like a different story about where it's cultivated and how they grow it and that sort of thing. And there were places like that in Myrtle Beach that were like a little more respectable, I think, in the way they process these hemp derivatives. So I was able to use that every once in a while, but if anyone has tried that before, it's not the same as cannabis. You know what I mean? It doesn't hit the same way. So, that didn't really work for me there. I didn't really grasp onto that too tightly. And as far as like psilocybin, right after my mom died, I had a friend in California send me a chocolate bar with psilocybin in it. And when I got it, it wasn't very strong. I set myself up for a journey because I felt like I really needed to after my mom passed away. And this chocolate bar was, I had what would be called like a museum experience. It wasn't a heroic dose. I didn't have a real healing experience from it, but it did help me kind of get back on my feet for a second and get back in the game. And that was great. But other than that, I mean, I was without these molecules the whole time I was there. So I couldn't lean on anything. The only thing I could lean on was my meditation practice, my breath work practice, my yoga practice, and the understanding and lessons that I got from prior plant medicine experiences. And those experiences had healed me in a way that I was able to move through this, again, with courage and grace. Towards the end, it got pretty difficult. My stepfather and I got to a point where we just couldn't reconcile with each other, and he was able to move around and drive and stuff like that. So I felt like it was time for me to move on. But that happened really quickly. And again, that's a whole other story. The crazy Mr. Toad's wild ride that I had from Myrtle Beach to my brother's house in Florida, and then back across the country to California, to Sonoma County. That's an epic tale in and of itself. And maybe I'll make a podcast about that, storytime podcast about that journey. But I left fairly abruptly after a pretty nasty argument that we had gotten into. And I had forgotten about the Geese. I hadn't really thought about them in a long time until the other day when I had that picnic and they were there, and it just really, like, all of this came flooding back to me. And I've done a good handful of plant medicine journeys between then and now. And I've been able to process a lot of this trauma that I accrued during that, from the loss of my mother and, dealing with a lot of childhood injuries from both of my father figures, and everything in between, everything that comes along with all of that. Like I said, the journey just to get back to California was crazy. It was fairly traumatic in and of itself. And there's a lot to process with that. But I guess the point of this is to kind of take notice of these little miracles that happen in your life when when you're going through something. Like, I feel like there's always some little thing that pops up, whether it's a song on the radio that you heard that reminded you of a better time, or, a bird or a cat coming up and laying on your lap. Or, just the little things, your children, their laughter, those kind of things can be incredibly healing, especially when you've gotten through the processing of whatever the trauma was that you were going through at the time. And those geese, when I saw them the other day, it just really made my day. Like, having a beautiful picnic with my beautiful partner who I love in the beautiful part of the park. And then these geese were there, and also a bunch of like hummingbirds and hawks and robins and ladybugs were there. You know what I mean? It was just this whole nature reset that I feel like I really needed. I hadn't had that in a minute. And I don't know. I just kind of want to share this with you guys. I don't know if it's off topic, and I might, kind of just tell some stories in my my podcast, because I have a lot of stories. I have lived a fairly interesting life, and I have found myself in some very, very interesting situations. And sometimes I call myself like the mystic Forrest Gump. Forrest Gump, he would find himself like in the Oval Office with Richard Nixon, or the "Have a Nice Day" T-shirt that he inspired some. You know what I mean? Like, I have so many moments in my life like that where I was just in the right place at the right time to experience something that was very interesting. And then, the beat goes on, the world keeps turning, something else happens. And I don't know, I like sharing those kind of things. I've made a couple of like social media posts telling stories about these kind of things. And, I'll probably use this podcast as a vehicle for that every once in a while, in between like talking about the actual plants and actual healing and the actual processes that I do. But, another thing that's really important for me is to experience what I'm trying to talk about or what I'm trying to teach or what I'm trying to offer. I don't believe in just reading a couple of books and hanging out a shingle and thinking that you know everything. I really believe in walking the walk before you talk the talk. And, I kind of just wanted to like showcase a little bit of how I've used different modalities while myself going through incredibly traumatic things, in conjunction with my psychedelic experiences, and how that's led to an integrated healing process for myself. And it's an ongoing thing, like every day something can happen, and every day we can choose to either deal with it with courage and grace and dignity, or to let it steamroll us. And no shame in letting it steamroll you. Like every once in a while you get steamrolled, like that's fine. But how do you get out of that? Right? How do you integrate it? How do you integrate the lessons? How do you figure out how to heal? I truly believe in the plants. I truly believe in the fungi. I truly believe in the psychedelic experience. I think that they go a long, long, long way towards healing trauma, just dealing with trauma, period. Even looking at your trauma, which can be very hard. Sometimes people can't even look at their own trauma. And, these molecules will help you to look at it in a way in which you'll be able to handle. And then the integrated process is the next step. And that's what we do at Bhairav Healing. We help with that, that integrated healing process. So if this resonates with any of you guys, give me a holler. Hit me up on the website, bhairavhealing.com. And, let's talk. Let's have a consultation. Let's see how we could walk each other down the path towards getting through your trauma, getting through your experiences, and not being so confused by them. All right, guys, thank you so much if you made it through this whole thing about me talking about geese and kind of like Tony Soprano and his ducks, right? I appreciate you guys. Everyone have a wonderful day. And I will see you next week when I make the next episode of the Bhairav Healing Podcast.